Okay, let's continue with presentations. Now let's transition to our next presentation featuring Nick Toon. Nick Toon is the author of the books Architecture Modernization, Principles and Practices of Domain-Driven Design. Nick also holds the role of principal consultant at Empathy Software, where he collaborates with technology leaders to shape strategy model domains and establish continuous delivery teams. Today, Nick will delve into the topic of architecting for independent value streams. Nick, pleasure to have you here with us.
Hello. Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back? No. Okay, cool. So where to start? I guess let's start with some thank yous. I mean, thank you for letting me be in Barcelona and not in the UK. Very different weather patterns at the moment. Well, so also thank you for the green. I really like this green. When I walked in this morning, I thought that is an epic bit of green behind that stage. That really caught my attention. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to all these sponsors who are sponsoring me personally. I like to think in my head. So I'm going to talk about value streams today and how that fits into architecture. And more specifically, I just want you to take a moment just to think about what was a turning point in your career. What was the moment that changed the direction your career was heading, or you thought it was heading? People normally say when they quit one of their jobs, so let's not think about quitting your job. What was another changing point in your career? You don't have to speak out loud. The reason I'm asking this is because I'm going to talk about one of mine in a minute, and I thought it would be good if you were able to remember what it feels like when you have one of those moments in your career that changes things. So for me, the story of this changing point starts in 2016, I think. So Salesforce, one part of Salesforce, they had some old legacy systems. They weren't able to make changes very often, and they wanted to improve their legacy. Lots of typical challenges, you know. Lots of teams, all in the same monolith, difficult to test, difficult to deploy, holding the company back. And for some reason, they were like, we need domain-driven design. And there is a guy called Nick, whose name is on a book about domain-driven design. So we're going to hire him. I think it went that way, because a couple of years before I'd written this book with Scott Millett. It's a bit out of date now. If you want a book on domain-driven design, I recommend Vladik's book. That's this guy here. So yeah, basically I got hired by Salesforce because I helped someone write a book about domain-driven design. So that's the first takeaway from this talk. If you're thinking, we need to hire someone who's an expert in X, and your only criteria is there's a book about X and their name's on it, don't trust that level of depth. The second thing I want to share with you today is, that's the first one. The second one is, I just wrote a new book. And if enough people buy copies of this, along with Neil, I'm going to buy a social network, and I'm going to completely solve this current mess that's happening. There you go. I've got 3 copies to give away. Obviously, that doesn't contribute to me buying a social network, but Manny will give me some vouchers. So yeah, first 3 people who want a voucher, who want a book, come to me with your email address, and you can have it. So let's get back to the story. Let's get back to this turning point. So I'm working at Salesforce. They got this big old monolith, lots of problems, difficult to change. Whole thing has to be deployed together. Takes about somewhere between 2 and 4 hours to compile the thing. And they want some domain-driven design. So I'm hired to try and help address this issue. And one of the reasons that the system is difficult to work with is because of the coupling. And one of the reasons for the coupling, in general and in this example, is that the way your software system is structured doesn't match, and this is difficult to explain, the way you think about your business domain, how you organize your business into different parts, into different subdomains, when that doesn't align with your software, you start to get a mismatch, as you can see here. So you might want to add a new feature in a certain part of your business, and as a result, you have to change multiple parts of your software. And so that's the coupling there. It could be owned by different teams. And what we want to get to is this kind of model, where you can say, we would like to change one part of our business, add a new feature in a particular subdomain, and you can touch one part of your code base. Obviously, a very simple and idyllic vision, but it's what we should be aiming for. And there's a lot we can do to go from that to that. Even if we can't get all the way, we can get quite close. So, as this DDD expert, because my name was on a book about DDD, my job was to make that happen, to get from this one, not this one to this one. And that's when I had the turning point. I realized, however we start identifying these business domain boundaries, whichever ones we choose, whatever happens, we're going to have software that will be aligned to these business domain boundaries, but we're still going to have teams that are aligned to the old software boundaries. When I spoke to the manager, he was very strongly of the opinion that he'd spent a long time building these teams, getting these people working together, and he didn't want me coming in with a chainsaw and chopping up the teams. And that was a real moment for me. That's when I realized, actually, if you want to be an architect, you can't just have your name on a DDD book. You actually need to think about the team organization as well. There's the business domain, there's the software architecture, and the teams. And if all of these three things aren't aligned somewhat reasonably, there's going to be some conflict and coordination and coupling. And that brings us to the modern approach, a way of thinking about architecture that represents all these different concepts. It's going to get a quick drink, back in a sec. Think about some turning points in your career again. Hey, I'm back. So a couple of years ago, a book called Team Topologies came out. Started talking about value streams. Coming at this problem from the aspect of more of an organizational perspective. But I think if we think about architecture in a modern context, it's really the concept of value streams that's important. A value stream is the sequence of activities a team goes through to build new features, all the way from identifying what should we build to implementing it in software, deploying it, and supporting it in production. And this is what companies want, right? This is what Salesforce wanted. They didn't want domain-driven design. They wanted these loosely coupled value streams where teams could make changes more independently and more quickly to be able to innovate faster. And I think that's really what architecture is about a lot these days. It's about supporting the organization being able to move more quickly. And so I think when we talk about the concept of value streams, we want to have some level of independence. It's very easy to not have independence. And I think there are these 4 criteria that every architect should be thinking about. When you're making architectural decisions, I think there are these 4 facets that are really important. So domain-aligned, outcome-oriented, team-empowered, and software decoupled. And I'll talk about each of these in a bit of detail throughout the talk. It is quite a high-level talk. I'm not going to go into super detail about everything, so if you catch me later, I'm happy to spend some more time going into specific topics in more detail. So let's talk about domain-aligned. What does this mean here? So I think a modern architect has to be skilled at identifying domain boundaries in the business they're working in. As I talked about before, if you want to have software that's loosely coupled, you need to be able to look at your business and think, how can we loosely couple parts of our business and reflect that in the software? The difficult part about this is, it's not a flowchart. I think you said that, right, Vlad? One of your talks? It's not a flowchart. That's Udi Dehaan, one of his quotes, okay. So basically, this process of identifying boundaries in a system, it's not a flowchart. Even if you're a DDD expert, you can't walk in and look at a company and say, here's your domain boundaries. And this simplified picture here kind of gives an overview of why that's correct. It's because different concepts in your business can be coupled in different ways. Are we implementing a new feature that touches all the blue things? Actually, blue is that way. Or are we implementing a new feature that touches all of the shapes? So we need to think about what kinds of coupling are we expecting? What's most common in our domain? And there might be other criteria. There's 2 examples here, but we've got shape, size, weight, material, other kinds of things that might not be visible here. So the first step is really just knowing what are the different heuristics that I can use as an architect to identify potential domain boundaries. Firstly, I can find these options, and then we can choose the best one. Very simple one here is just to identify some user journeys and processes and start chunking them up into different steps. Very, very simple and boring e-commerce example here, nothing special about this, but this actually comes up quite a lot. So in this particular example, we might have search and browse, product details, cart and checkout, reviews. First attempt at identifying possible domain boundaries, quite easy, nothing too complex here. It gives us a starting point and something to work with. But we also need to look for commonality, concepts that appear in multiple different journeys or multiple different steps, and ask the question, does it make sense to extract all of these into their own subdomain? In this example, we're going with potential notifications. In other examples, you might say, actually, no. These things might look the same, but actually they're not that much the same. They're different in each of these steps, so we'll keep them separate. It's never always do this. It's always understanding the nuances. So what would you do in this example? You've got a customer, and you've got these 3 potential subdomains, and you can see that the customer appears in all of them. Should you create a customer domain? Has anyone ever created a customer domain or seen a customer domain? You're all lying. I've seen it a lot. It is, in my experience, it's quite a common anti-pattern to see this kind of customer or user domain. And what happens is everything about the user ends up in there, like profile preferences, orders, order history, reviews, everything. So what we can do instead is we can take some inspiration from domain-driven design, and we can look at how language can start helping us to shape these boundaries. So we can start asking, we've got this general concept of a customer or this person. What do different people in our organization use to describe that person or that concept? In marketing, they talk about a lead. In journeys, they're talking about a rider. But it's actually the same person with the same identity, just with a different name. And these changes in language, these specializations in language, are giving us clues about the boundaries. Another example is looking at the different kinds of roles each subdomain can play. This can give us a clue about different kinds of behaviors. In this example here, we've got something from the advertising. We've got building a campaign, running a campaign, and optimizing a campaign. Now, if you think about the 3 different kinds of behaviors going on here, building a campaign, that's all about creating some description of what you want to happen. You haven't actually done anything at that point. You just said, I want a campaign that looks like this, targets these users, with this budget, with these creatives, just a wish at this point, a specification. Then the running subdomain actually is going to take that wish list and actually apply some rules and processes and try and make happen what you've requested. And optimization, again, is another different kind of behavior. It's analyzing what's happening, and it's identifying possible improvements and suggestions. So those are 4 different kinds of heuristics. There's many others, but for the first part of being an architect, working in the business domain space, I think learning heuristics like that is crucial. And one of the best ways to learn and apply these heuristics is using techniques like event storming. So if all of this kind of thing isn't the kind of architecture work you've been doing, I recommend checking out some other communities. There's a lot of people out there trying to do this stuff. Como Camp's a good example of a conference or a community trying to make these collaborative techniques like event storming more popular. That's the first part. That's the first step of these independent value streams. Second crucial point is about being outcome-oriented. So Anna Shipman makes a great point here. You don't want to be optimizing to save costs if your company is trying to innovate as quickly as possible, or vice versa. Making architectural choices, even choosing domain boundaries, is all about knowing what are the actual outcomes our company's trying to optimize for. And that can be difficult when you talk to the CEO and he's got a different opinion every day, but we have to at least try and make it look like we've made an effort. And I think that's a crucial skill for modern architects, actually knowing those business outcomes, not just being up to date on the latest cloud technologies, but actually knowing the business outcomes. So, if this is something that's new to you, a very simple technique and a very old technique, and something I use quite often, is Ansoff's matrix. It's a couple of questions, basically, that you can ask to start having some conversations about what's that company trying to achieve. You've got products, and you've got markets. Are we trying to, as a company, develop our existing products for our existing markets, or are we trying to build new products for new markets, totally different customers? And that can give you all kinds of insights about the architecture. Are we going to optimize for reuse? Are we going to optimize for speed? Are we going to modernize the legacy or focus on building new stuff? These kind of focuses can help you get clarity on that. Here's an example from BBC, and not a company I worked for. This is publicly available. This is why I picked it. But what I like about this example, it represents a very common kind of trade-off in architecture. And what's important is how BBC went about making this choice. So very often, as companies start out, companies build one product and then multiple products, and each of those products tends to be optimized independently. That's what happened here. BBC had children's education, there's a typo in children's, home, news, sport, and weather. Each of these things had a good user experience, but the consistency across them wasn't particularly well joined up. And they were suffering, maybe not suffering, but noticing the effects of duplication. Are we building the same thing twice? Are we missing some opportunities here? So they had this question, should we create horizontal? Should we create, for example, a search platform and a topics platform that's used by all of these verticals? And they made a decision to do this. It could have gone either way, but they made a decision was, as a company, we're trying to innovate faster, and we believe that by building these shared capabilities, these horizontals, that will allow these vertical slices to innovate faster, because we're going to take away a bunch of stuff they currently have to deal with, so they'll have more capacity to do what they're actually trying to achieve. As an architect, if you haven't really done much of this, there's a bunch of techniques out there to think about the big picture, the portfolio, and the strategy. From domain-driven design, there's core domain charts, looking at your different domains and your parts of your architecture and thinking out, what's core to the business and what's generic. Something else that's out there is Wardley mapping. A bit more complex, but it is very useful. I would recommend learning some techniques like that. And the outcomes, understanding business outcomes, is actually also very important for the next part, which is talking about teams. Having clear business outcomes allows teams to make more decisions, which is beneficial for a couple of reasons. One is teams don't have to go outside the team and get blocked waiting for an answer. And the second one is teams are closer to the customer. They can make better decisions in isolation rather than being told by some management, go build this feature. Whoops. And that's what Marty Kagan talks about. If you look in the product management space, a lot of these themes are happening over in product management. They're talking about this concept of empowered product teams, where it's people in product management who are saying, we think that teams, developers, testers, that these cross-functional teams, that they should have more inputs or more control over the decisions they're making about the products they're building. So there's a lot of things converging here, product management, architecture, and having these clear business outcomes on both the strategic level and per value stream is also crucial. And having those metrics on a value stream level also helps you to validate, have you chosen the right boundaries? So let's talk about the team aspect, point 3 out of 4. And I think, again, I wasn't good at this when I worked at Salesforce. That was my turning point, thinking more about the teams aspect. But I think nowadays, with concepts like Conway's Law, architects really have to know about the organizational aspect. Do you agree, Vlad? He agrees. So let's dig into this one a bit more. So I'm a consultant, and a lot of my work is trying to facilitate groups and get them to think about these topics in different ways and how they might apply them to their company. And one of my favorite activities is just to ask people, what's more important, architecture and organization structure, or empowered and motivated teams? You get a couple of people sitting on the fence, but what you see here is pretty representative of what usually happens. People think, in general, that having good teams it's not a simple question, right? It's not either or, but people generally lean towards the teams aspect. Having teams that are empowered and motivated and skilled is more important than having a great architecture. So as an architect, if you're over here, you're missing out all the important and good stuff over there. I'm not saying you should go and live over there. I'm just saying it's important to have a perspective on both of these things. So if you're coming at this from not having done much of this before, I think there's a lot of great work out there. And this particular diagram by John Cutler is very useful for thinking about what are all of the steps in a value stream and how are we currently working as a company. And yeah, one of the things I like to do is just ask people, different people in the company, put a dot where you think you are now on this chart. And some people say, we've got different teams at different stages, that's also fine. And then put a dot of where you'd like to be. And this can help you to think about what's that journey you need to go on, how far away are you on the team aspect. And it gives you a model for talking about this in your company. It's not just, we need to have autonomous, empowered teams, which means a lot of different things for different people. You've actually got a very structured approach here, something you can almost quantify. Team topologies also has some interesting content here you can use as an architect. In a more practical fashion, I found the independent service heuristics to be very useful. It's basically a checklist. You go through this checklist. Let's say you've got some options about your architecture. You can architect your system in 3 different ways. The independent service heuristics will allow you to explore some of the pros and cons from a more organizational perspective to help you validate those choices. So one example we did, this was from a couple of years ago, I think now, working with a company, they were going from one product or one vertical to multiple, and they were going through this challenge of, we've never built these horizontal platforms before, but now we're going to have to do that. Are we going about this in the right way? And as we went through the independent service heuristics, started talking about cost tracking and decisions, and what we realized is the company wanted to have a funding model where the horizontal team wouldn't have any budget. How are you going to build stuff without budget? Well, what was going to happen was the vertical teams would pay them. A vertical team would say, we need this feature, we'll give you this amount of money to build it. You might think, well, what's wrong with that? The problem is the horizontal team doesn't have enough autonomy. They can't think long term. They're just like an internal outsourcing model. We'll pay you to build something, you build it. You don't have enough control over that. You can't decide what you should build, what you think's best for the company. So we just raised that as a flag. The independent service heuristics isn't another flowchart. If you answer these questions and say, yeah, we got some concerns here, it doesn't mean you shouldn't go ahead. It's just raising the issues, and you can decide how you want to handle that immediately or continue, but address those problems later. So the key thing about this example is we weren't talking about funding models and budgets at this point. We were talking about architecture, team topologies, organization structure, coffee, everything except the funding model. And by going through this checklist, it pointed us towards the funding model, and that was one of the key concerns that hadn't been raised before. In your particular scenarios, it might be other things that come up, not the funding model, something else. But the checklist is useful because it helps you shine a light on things you might not be thinking about. So here's some books in that space. I won't go over those. You can get them in the slide deck. And then we get to the last part, which is the software decoupled, the bit you've all been waiting for, the actual technical bit. So, you want me to look away now, Vlad? I'm going to butcher your work. It's going to completely misrepresent everything you spent the last 10 years working on. And you got a front row seat for it. So one of my observations as a consultant is when we talk about software architecture, when we talk about coupling and complexity, it very often gets to coupling bad. And I'm really not exaggerating here. Someone will draw some design and someone else will say, look, there's a dependency, that's bad coupling. You know, there's coupling here, we can't accept that. But actually, there's always going to be coupling. And I think mature teams, mature architects are able to talk about system design, are able to talk about concepts like coupling and complexity with a more nuanced vocabulary and identify what level of coupling can we deal with here? When have we got a problem and when is a coupling not a problem? So Vlad, he's got this formula which is about measuring pain. Don't know why he chose pain. You can ask him yourself later, but I think it's kind of, I like it, so I'm happy with it. Basically, the pain of any piece of coupling between two parts of a system is the strength of that coupling times the volatility times the distance. So feel free to correct me at any point during the next couple of minutes. Strength is how much does one component know about another? Is one component talking to a nice API, or is it going straight in the back, reaching into the database, coupled to your entire schema? That's the strength, right? How much does one component know about another? If I looked in component A, how much information could I learn about component B just by looking at component A? Then you've got volatility, how often the two things change. You might have an incredible strength of coupling, but those two things don't change very often. And I think volatility is something that I use a lot. For example, people often say, we've got a system and everything's coupled to everything. We've tried to decouple it and it's just not possible. There's coupling everywhere. We just can't decouple our system. That's never correct. But one of the things you can do is you can say, well, draw it to me. So people will draw things like a circle connected to other things, and then we can just go through each of those dependencies and ask about the volatility. So how often does this component here and this component change? Someone might say, well, actually, this one over here, it's just static data. It changes once a month. Or it might even be something like, yeah, we built that 2 years ago, and I don't think we've changed it since. So even though there's some coupling there, and even though the strength of that coupling might be very high, the volatility is so low that the pain is going to be quite low. And then distance is how close are the two concepts, the two components that are changing together. If you've got two variables in the same function, or two lines of code next to each other, they're basically as close together as you could possibly get. But now imagine we've got two lines of code in two different microservices, in two different systems, owned by two different companies, with teams working in different countries, in different time zones. That's quite a big distance. And so that, even if the strength of the coupling was low and the volatility was medium, that distance alone could be quite problematic. So Vladic's formula gives us a language we can use to have more nuanced conversations and identify what coupling is really problematic here and what can we afford to deal with. So here's his model of strength. I talked about the nice clean API, which would be contract coupling and reaching into the database, knowing about all the internals. That would be intrusive. There's a couple of others, but I'll skip over those for now. Something else that's been very influential from the work Vlad's been doing over the past few years is the concept of local and global complexity. So when microservices first started popping onto the scene, we started hearing lots of comments like, oh, every microservice should be 100 lines of code. Then it's very simple. You can understand it very easily. You can replace it very easily. And all of those things are correct, but there's still another piece of the picture. That's the local complexity, right? Each service in and of itself is small and simple. Yes, the local complexity is good, but now the global complexity of having more pieces has increased. More pieces, more dependencies. And if we're talking about microservices, we've got a network involved, which would be a greater distance. So just by using these terms, I've been able to have much more useful conversations about dependencies and coupling and trade-off, and I think this is definitely something I would recommend to everyone here to try and learn about these terms and try and use them more. You'll have more effective conversations. I think something else, obviously I wrote a book about domain-driven design, so I'm going to talk about DDD a little bit. But this is actually touching on a problem I do see a lot, which is where the domain doesn't drive the architecture. So what I often see is, what's the way to describe it? I would say behaviors in a system just end up in random places because that was the easiest place to put that new feature at the time it was being built. And those systems don't have very clear names. It might have names like Snowflake or something about Star Wars. And when I try and talk to people about these systems and we talk about their architecture, we're just talking about the names of databases and the names of systems. And I'm really struggling to work out, what is this system doing? What are the capabilities on a business level that this system has? And so I think techniques like message flow modeling from domain-driven design can be very useful here. You have to design your architecture using only concepts from your domain, commands, events, and queries, and the names of your different subdomains. So I think this is, it's a simple thing, but it can also, like using a different language for coupling, it can make a big difference. And I think tooling, I think Neil was touching on tooling a bit just now. What place does tooling have for the modern architects? And I think tools have a lot of consequences and side effects. I'm not saying tools good or tools bad, but I think there are some tools out there which I'm getting really impressed with at the moment. And for me, the tool I'm seeing most often using different contexts to have some real impact on projects is CodeScene. I don't have any affiliation to CodeScene, but CodeScene is going to analyze your version control history. So it can do things like correlate changes happening in different microservices, in different code bases. And an example that I saw recently, for example, was a new CTO joined a company, and he's got some questions around the strategy to make, and he was able to use CodeScene and to quickly identify something like, I forgot the number now, I always forget things. I think it was like 40% of the system has only been worked on by contractors here. So yes, we can save some money by letting those contractors go, but at the same time, we're going to lose knowledge about 40% of our system. And he was able to use CodeScene to explain that technical architectural thing in a way that made sense on a business level and explain that to business stakeholders. So I'm not an expert in CodeScene. I'm trying to use it more often. I see it being used more often. And I do think it's a great example of a tool that can fit into a modern architect's toolbox. That's basically it. I'm going to quickly wrap things up, and then we can do some questions, either questions for me or probably all your questions are for Vlad about his interesting stuff. I'm not going to mention Vlad again anymore. Sorry, Vlad. That was 2 more times. So basically, the idea is, I think if I simplify this whole talk into a few ideas, when I was contacted by Salesforce in 2016 about working on their architecture using DDD, as a consultant nowadays, when people contact me about architecture and DDD, what most companies want is to be able to deliver software faster. Not just cranking out features faster and building technical debt, being able to add improvements to their products in a sustainable way, but it's usually about being able to innovate faster. That's what companies want, teams that can innovate faster. To get there, software plays an important role in that. If teams can work highly independently and change certain parts of a system and not have to coordinate all of their work with other teams who work in the same parts of the system, then that makes a big impact on how quickly teams can deliver. And to get to that loosely coupled software, we need to have loosely coupled parts of our business, what we call domains and subdomains in DDD. How do we think about this as a modern architect? What's a common building block we can use? I think that's value streams from team topologies, the concept of if we want to design a system that enables us to have work flowing through our company faster, and we need a concept that represents work flowing through our company, and that's what value streams are. But we can easily create value streams that lead to lots of coupling. So I think it's important to strive for independent value streams. That doesn't mean isolated. There's always going to be some coupling. But I think by focusing on these 4 characteristics of domain-aligned, outcome-oriented, team-empowered, and software decoupled, I think that can help us to get much closer to a high level of independence and autonomy. And I think what this means for people who are architects is, it's not just about being an expert in one area nowadays. You've got to connect a lot of different dots to be a modern architect. I'm going to have to get closer to read these. Need to be skilled at identifying business domain boundaries, knowing which outcomes to optimize for. What's your company trying to achieve? How does your architecture connect to that? Letting your domain drive your architecture. Knowing about teams, as we talked about with the John Cutler diagram. Having this nuanced vocabulary for talking about systems, for talking about coupling and complexity, and being able to use tools, architecture tools, judiciously. There's quite a lot going on there. It's not easy to be an architect these days, but I don't think it's impossible either. And I think if you put attention into those different areas, you can be a great architect. So that's the talk. Thanks for joining me. And I hope that the next interesting turning point in your career is close. Maybe even today. Maybe talk to someone new today, and maybe something interesting could happen in your career. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. We already have a lot of questions. So let's start. The first one is, how do you decide when it makes sense to split an architecture horizontally versus vertically, as in your BBC example?
Yeah, so good question about I often say that architecture is about verticals and horizontals. Which things stay vertical, customer-focused, and where do you create these horizontals? And really, that question about where do you create horizontals is about that age-old question of reuse, right? When do we create reuse? These horizontal platforms that are used by different parts of the system. I think it's always a very difficult question to answer. I've created some checklists in the past to help with this decision-making process. So I guess I'll go through some of those things now. I guess the first one, if we think about speed, if you're going to create a horizontal, will it allow other teams that consume the horizontal to move quickly? What can happen in a lot of cases is that horizontal can become a bottleneck. You've got maybe 4, 5, or even 10 or 20 teams that all use this platform, and they're all asking for new features at the same time, and the platform team's like, yeah, we can't do all that in the next 20 years, so someone's got to lose out. And because of that, then this platform team spends a lot of their time just dealing with the politics and prioritization and does even less work. So I think the first question to ask is, in terms of that team's ability to service all of their customers, so understanding what are people going to need from that platform, and will we be able to put a team owning that platform who can actually support all of those requirements? It might be that the platform has multiple sub-teams inside it who each deal with certain challenges. So that's one aspect. What would be another aspect? I think another aspect is probably going to be around the business outcomes in the business domain. I don't want to make sweeping statements about architects or enterprise architects especially, but you may want to cover your ears now. But basically, I think there's a tendency when you're working at a very high level and you're not in the details, it's very easy to think you're making a good decision when you're making a very bad decision. And sometimes at that high level, you see things that look the same and you're like, yeah, we're going to put all of those into a platform because they look the same. Could be something around the customer or notifications, or it could be, what's an example? An example from my career would be basically a package building system. We've got these different parts of the company who all need to build packages. And you might say, so that means we should build one package building system. Why should we have 3 of these in the company when we could just have one? But when you look at each of those teams individually and what they're trying to achieve and the abstractions they need, actually the way they build packages is so different that when you get into the details, it doesn't make sense to build a generic system because you'd have to make it so generic it just wouldn't be that useful. So I think two key points to answer that question would be, can a team keep up with all the requirements that are expected of them from all the teams using the platform? And the second one will be more around the domain itself. Like, can you create a platform with abstractions that work for all those different consumers? Or do they have very different needs and expectations and abstractions?
Okay, thank you, Nick. Amazing topic, well done and very timely. In your experience, how did you influence the other non-technical people like product stakeholders or managers? Any tips?
Good question. How did I specifically introduce other people? Probably by being passive-aggressive when I was younger, and then slowly realizing that, you know, building relationships and trust is important. I think it's probably, you know, a bit arm-waving, a bit generic, but I would say, you know, work isn't a transactional thing. It's not like you want to build some new feature or you want to refactor the architecture, so I'll go talk to the product team and get their thoughts on this. I think you want to be at a point where you can have that conversation and already have some level of trust from them. So I think just on a daily basis, just trying to nurture those relationships with those different stakeholders, just reaching out, asking them what they're up to, or trying to find some reason to talk to them. And then when it does come to the point where you've got to make a big decision, you've got that, you know, social capital with them, that trust, that you can ask difficult questions. On a more practical level, something that you can probably apply on a more shorter term, for more immediate impact, I would say techniques like event storming have been incredibly powerful for me in my career over the last 7 or 8 years. Event storming is a technique where you bring all these stakeholders together to solve some problem together. So you probably get a room like this, maybe a whole wall like that would be pretty nice, and you map out the whole end-to-end flows in parts of your business. You've got sales, marketing, support, product, all those people together. So just encouraging that collaborative ways of working and using techniques that bring different groups together and allow them to collaborate in an effective way, and not necessarily where one group is controlling it and the others are partaking, trying to even things out. And if you want to take that further, there's some really interesting concepts in the book, Liberating Structures, ways of like bringing groups together and minimizing some biases and hierarchy.
Okay. What are the main arguments you use to convince the adoption of a new DDD strategy at C-level over an existing system, considering the cost of implementation and the learning curve?
Good question. I think this can apply to DDD and other concepts in general. Like, should you go DDD explicitly, and you know, we're going all DDD, sometimes using a buzzword like that can get people excited, it can get buy-in, it can make people feel like, yeah, we're doing something different, we're taking a new approach, it's going to be different this time. And sometimes actually using a buzzword can have the opposite effect, where people have heard about DDD or they're worried that we're just chasing some shiny buzzwords. So I think it's always important to first ask, you know, if you want to use a buzzword, or if you want to bring the techniques in without necessarily talking about the buzzword itself. But let's say you did want to introduce something like DDD, bring that into your company. There's quite a few different ways to do that. Again, I think techniques like event storming are really useful, because you can propose, okay, we want to modernize some parts of our system. Before we can do that, we need to get the people who understand how it works together, product people, UX people, developers, support people. We need to get those people together to map out how the current system works. And then once you've mapped this out on an event storm, you can start chopping it up into domains and subdomains and thinking about how you might implement the new system. So already you've done some domain-driven design there. You've brought these groups to collaborate together. You've mapped out a system using event storming, and you've identified possible structures. And at that point, you can then start talking about DDD more explicitly. So the other approach would be just to say, okay, let's say you're a new CTO, for example. You join a company and you want to introduce this DDD approach. If you're going to do it that way, I think it makes sense to talk about DDD in the company, have some internal sessions to discuss the idea, have some Slack channels where people can talk about this. But I think the question was about this, at the C-level, right? How would you convince the
Yeah.
C-level? So I think in my experience, if I was going to try and pitch this to the C-level, I think what works best in that particular example is probably coming at it with something like team topologies. Team topologies seems to be something that C-level people are keen on. They've read about this, they've heard about this. So you can talk about team topologies and the benefits on the organizational side, and then you can say, to actually implement team topologies, to get to those streamlined teams, that's where you need to apply domain-driven design to map out the business, to design the software, and so you can fit those two concepts together.
Okay, thank you. And how architects can influence on team structure?
How architects can influence team structure? You should be doing this all the time, really. I think whenever the architecture changes, you need to be thinking about how the team will change. So if I try and dig into that question, I guess, when I worked at Salesforce, I wasn't really able to do that. The team structure was a bit fixed. So I guess I'd probably work on that one a bit earlier, actually. I'd probably start mentioning the idea that, if we start changing our architecture, the team will need to change as well. I'd probably try and make that connection very explicit early in the process, and I'd use something like Conway's Law. Like most people talk about Conway's Law, so you can say, like, look, if we're going to change the software, it's going to affect the organization and vice versa. So I think in that example, I would say Conway's Law, like make sure people understand Conway's Law, and then the idea of changing software and changing teams at the same time, kind of a natural fit if people agree with Conway's Law.
Okay. And given vertical product team, what would be a good approach to bring more awareness and start transiting into a more horizontal team?
So if you're going to try and work in a horizontal team that builds a platform for other teams, I guess you've got to switch your focus. If you're a vertical team, normally you're building stuff directly for the customer. If you're in a horizontal team, you're normally building stuff for other teams in the company. So I think, first step is, what is that team trying to achieve? You need to start understanding your domain and subdomain that your platform supports, but also what are the concepts in those subdomains of other teams that are using your platform? How do you build a model that can support all of those different teams? So you need to learn about your parts of the domain, and you also need to learn about their parts of the domain as well.
Okay, and last question. So how specific domain frameworks like mine for financial companies applies as solutions are worthy in some way?
Could you repeat that one, please? I heard some music out here.
Yeah, how specific domain frameworks like mine for financial companies applies as solutions are worthy in some way?
So if I've understood correctly, it's around like domain frameworks, kind of like existing industry terminology and ontologies and things. I don't think I've ever seen, if I've understood the question correctly, I probably haven't, sorry for that, but I'll answer the one I think I'm answering anyway. Basically, you take some like industry framework or model for talking about the domain you're working in, and I don't think I've ever seen one of those, completely as is. Normally, it's used as inspiration and useful, but never really just take it, adopt it, and build your architecture around something that's been defined elsewhere. I think ultimately, unless you have some compliance or other regulation that says you have to, all your architectural choices should be based on exactly what's optimal for your company, even if that doesn't seem to fit with some industry conventions.
Thank you very much, Nick. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.